What's up YouTube, Dale here from Zephyr, and today I'm going to take you through an in-depth video talking about all of the best side deck cards for the upcoming format. So Phantom Nightmare has officially released, so it means that there are a lot of decks that are getting buffs and a lot of decks coming back into the format in the form of stuff like Yugioh, Ray Raptors, and of course even the brand new Goblin Bikers may catch you by surprise. So which 15 cards should you be looking at to put into your side deck that can be the most effective going forward into this format, whether you're playing an underdog rogue deck or whether you're playing one of the main meta decks? Well, I'm going to take you through some of those options that you can utilize in order to help you get that advantage during games 2 and 3, or some of the cards that you should be maining and definitely might want to consider. So with all of that out of the way, please smash that like button, hit that notification bell and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more upcoming content. So we're going to start off with the very basic one. Now, I'm only going to touch on this card very, very briefly because it should be in your main, and if it's not in the main, it's 100% in your side, and that is, of course, Droll and Lck Bird. So in a format where we are running around with cards such as Bonfire in order to search out Populous to then search out one of your Snake Eyes spells, and not to mention as well when you're looking at stuff like the Voiceless Voice that does a lot of searching. Yes, some decks can play through Droll and Lck Bird, and I do expect as we move into this format, a lot of players will learn how to play around it. It is still an incredibly powerful and oppressive card. The best thing about something like Droll and Lck Bird is it hits most decks as a wide range variety. So it will hit those odd rogue decks as well as the main meta decks. So definitely one of them cards that you consider putting in the main deck, if not the side deck. Moving on in continuing through the side deck, let's talk about the best board breaker around, and that is, in my opinion, Evenly Matched. Now, the reason Evenly Matched is such a good board breaker is if your opponent is not ending on some sort of Omni Negate that you cannot bait out, you are able to break your opponent's board all the way down to 1. It's a very nice trade-off. Now, a lot of competitive players, once they get to that point, start to play around Droll and Lck Bird, also try to play around Evenly Matched, and of course Nibiru, so to become less effective the higher tables you go, but it's definitely something to consider. I think it's an incredibly powerful card that will help you break most boards, definitely at your local environment, and it's one of them cards that a lot of players dread, and they always need to try and deal with where at all possible. There are counter sides to counter sides, and what I mean by that is some people might even consider Artifact Lancer in order to deal with stuff like Evenly Matched, as well as being able to deal with cards like Soul Release in order to stop you banishing your opponent's cards, or stop your opponent banishing your cards, so you can still maintain advantage. Going into the upcoming format, we can definitely assume that there will be a lot of graveyard capable effects when you're looking at the Promethean Princess, which is utilizing the graveyard, as well as the Fire King cards and Snake Eye cards. A card like Abyss Dweller, if you're able to utilize it to its max potential, can be absolutely devastating. Speaking of cards that take away the graveyard, this is why some of the rogue decks such as Kashtira and of course Thundereeze are being highly considered to compete in the upcoming meta for the pure fact that they can play Dimension Shifter. When you're able to take away your opponent's graveyard, not only do you take away their ability to utilize the Fire King cards, but you also take away their ability to utilize the Promethean Princess to be able to disrupt you during your turn. Now, there are some decks out there that may not main it, unlike Kashtira's and Thundereeze, but could very easily side it. When you're looking at Yugioh, that is definitely one of the decks that if they wanted to adapt it to a more control style build, they could actually main deck DShifter, or you side it in when you take away your cards that rely on the graveyard. You can look at other decks as well. Sprites is definitely one of them ones that can utilize something like DShifter and of course Branded, which will cause your opponent a lot of issues. The issue with DShifter is it is not consistent enough. There isn't a guaranteed way to search it, and there isn't a guaranteed way to make sure your graveyard is empty. But it's definitely one of them cards that I feel if your deck can play it, you definitely want to be considering putting it in the side deck. Talking about cards that deal with the graveyard, another one that I really do like at this moment in time is DD Crow. Now, a lot of people do go with Soul Release, and to me, Soul Release is good because it lets you banish 5 from the graveyard rather than just 1. However, Soul Release is a normal spell card, which does have a little bit of a drawback in the sense that it cannot be utilized during your opponent's turn. It's not as fast as DD Crow, and by the time you're banishing them cards from the graveyard, they may have already used their effects. Yes, it's great against Promethean Princess, but if you're not able to kind of utilize it to its max potential, are you better off playing a card like DD Crow, which is a step up from the Bestials because it allows you to banish any card rather than just a light or dark. Speaking of other cards in order to control your opponent's board state, a card that is very, very powerful as a floodgate is Anti-Spell Fragrance. Now, this is very subjective down to the deck that you are playing, because if you rely on spells at all, it can come back to bite you in the backside massively, and it's something you might want to avoid than actually play. However, when you're able to use a card such as Anti-Spell Fragrance, it does limit your opponent's usability with some of their cards like Lightning Storms, Triple Tactics Talents, Thrusts, you name it. So you do need to be a little bit careful when you're activating a card like this, but if you are able to resolve it quite like DShifter and utilize it to your advantage, you will be able to outgrind that game and hopefully put in the win, which is why a deck like Labyrinth is also going to be a massive contender coming up for this upcoming format. So you're either going to be utilizing the graveyard in the form of stuff like your Labyrinths and of course your Fire decks, or you're going to be trying to take away the graveyard usability in stuff like Kashtiras and Flunderees, not to mention some others that can utilize those cards. Speaking of Labyrinths, cards you need to deal with their back row. Well, Harpy's Feather Duster is pretty much a no-brainer, alongside cards like Lightning Storm that allow you to deal with back row or front row. Another card that I do highly consider is, of course, Cosmic Cyclone. Now, the reason you're going to be utilizing a card like Cosmic Cyclone is because some of the main meta decks in the form of the Fire Kings do have protection for their field spell. Whereas if you're able to Cosmic Cyclone away their field spell, you're going to try and implore a own self-board nuke. There we go, get my words right eventually. You're going to try and get Fire King Island to self-destruct their opponent's board, which does mean that there's one less thing for you to need to worry about. Especially if your opponent's cards are all negate your opponent's effects and they can't negate their own effects when they're going to lose their board thanks to their own Fire King Island. Not to mention that, but also Cosmic Cyclone can be utilized against floodgates that you may face at your local environment, whether it be stuff like, of course, Anti-Spell Fragrance, whether it be stuff like Summon Limit, you will be able to deal with those. And I do feel that Cosmic Cyclone is a very good all-round card that can be utilized to deal with back row in the upcoming format. Another card that is kind of making the waves, and that's just because it deals with the graveyard, is of course Graykeeper's Inscription. Quite like Soul Release, with Graykeeper's Inscription, it is a normal spell card. So the issue with that is because you're trying to utilize a normal spell card, the chances are by the time you're trying to turn off your opponent's graveyard, all you're really doing is turning off the Promethean Princess, when it's something you could very easily do with a DD Crow. So it might mean that you're going to get a bit more utility out of a DD Crow than you will a Graykeeper's Inscription. But I thought it would be something to mention, as when you're watching loads of videos online trying to get as much knowledge for the upcoming format, you understand why Graykeeper's Inscription is being mentioned. The next card that we're going to be talking about that is also another card that is being mentioned in the upcoming format is Made to Order. Now this is a spell card that did get a little bit of hype when it was first introduced, but the idea is you're allowed to target one card in your opponent's graveyard, banish it, and then add a card of the same name from the deck to the hand. Now this is absolutely amazing when we're moving into a format where we do expect there to be loads of mirror matches, so you can utilize it by banishing a copy of your opponent's cards and then searching out one of your own. On top of that, it does also give you the ability to gain cards that might be a little bit more generic and stapled if you want to be searching out your own hand trap, or if you wanted to be able to search out a card like Kashtira Fenrir, which is going to be utilized in most meta decks. Again, the issue with a card like this is the fact that it is a normal spell card, so it can only be utilized once your opponent has already built up a bit of advantage, and it can't be utilized in order to deal with some of those pesky extra deck monsters because you're not able to add those from the deck to the hand. Again, this is another card that's just being mentioned around, and I thought I'd explain in as much detail as possible why it is being considered, because it can be utilized against some of those staple cards that you may share with your opponent, but that really does come down to if you are playing in the main meta deck, or if you're playing a deck that you expect to be facing multiple times at the local environment. Another spell card that can be absolutely utilized to break a board is, of course, Super Poly. Now, when you're looking at this, Yugioh is now the deck that is a Super Poly absolute massive colossal in the game, because the fact that it just requires a Yugioh monster and then it can Super Poly your opponent's entire board -1 just so you can get the damage off is absolutely insane. Not to mention, when you do look into the format, Garura and of course Mud Dragon are going to be great targets for this upcoming format. The ability to break your opponent's board and not allow them to respond can be near devastating, as well as giving you a card that is going to allow you to provide targeted protection or of course just a draw capability. Now, the difference with Super Poly is it will adapt the extra deck if you are not main decking it already and you do not have the space in the extra deck to main those targets, so it is something to consider. It can be good in a Pot of Prosperity deck because it means if you're not playing Super Poly in the main deck, your Pot of Prosperity targets are going to be very easy to decipher, and then from that point on, when you do put in Super Poly, you're going to change up your strategy, and it does give you a great capability for going first or second, so it has a nice all-round balance. Moving on to the next one, with there being so many hand traps, Drolls, Veilers, and of course Ash Blossoms running around, you can highly consider that Triple Tactics Talents is going to be a card that is going to be utilized to its max potential. So this is another one where in combo with Anti-Spell Fragrance, it can be very damaging, but the idea behind that is the pure fact that your opponent activates a hand trap, you activate talents, not only do you get the option to draw 2, but you can also get the option to look at your opponent's hand and take away one of their combo starters or just one of their many resources that they may or may not need. On top of that as well, it is a great card for going second. Being able to steal one of your opponent's boss monsters can really cause them a lot of issues and do a 1-for-1 trade. The idea is that if you're considering playing something like Change of Heart or Mind Control, you can get all 3 of those jobs done with a Triple Tactic Talents that can be played at free. The only downside of a triple tactic talents is if your opponent plays around it or does not use a hand trap during your turn, it does become a very useless card, which is why it is more considered as a go second card than something that you put in the main deck, because it also gives you that ability to kind of see what your opponent is playing, whether they're playing control deck, and whether it is used full to take up those 3 slots. Another card that can help you break boards, negate boards, and do everything you need to is, of course, Forbidden Droplet. Now, the reason this is being considered over something like Dark Rule No More is because a lot of opponents' cards will be able to be utilized a lot earlier on. Not to mention there is a little trick that can be used with Forbidden Droplet in order to make sure you can get a free search before being drolled. So for those of you that are unaware of this, the idea is that once you complete your first search, you will have turn player priority if it is in fact your turn. And as long as your opponent has a monster on the board, you can activate Forbidden Droplet, send in a monster in order to negate said monster on the board. And because you sent a monster, your opponent cannot respond to that chain with a monster effect, meaning that they cannot draw and Lck Bird you on that particular search. So you get 1 search for free, but it does sacrifice 1 monster in your hand and or on your field. Not to mention, Forbidden Droplet can be utilized in order to chain against multiple opponents' boards, and it also means it allows you to give you a bit more presence in order to negate your opponent's board, build your board up, and half the damage. So you can use it in damage step in order to get you as maximum damage infliction to your opponent as possible. Then moving on to another one that is being mentioned in this format, and again, it was something that I was really surprised about when I saw it, but thankfully I had it explained to me as to why it's being used, and that is, of course, Shidel Fusion. Now, I know a lot of you are like, whoa, what the hell is Shidel Fusion doing? Well, the idea is that Shidel Fusion is a 1-card way of being able to rip your opponent's graveyard apart, pop a back row, and provide a negate. Now, a lot of people are playing Aerial, and a lot of people are playing Dragon, and the idea is you would activate Shidel Fusion, send in both those cards from deck to the graveyard to create Cyclone, and then from that point on, you would build a chain of a negate, a back row pop, and then a banish free from the graveyard. Like I said, this format that we are going into is definitely going to be graveyard reliant, and that is why you want to be able to provide as many ways as possible to deal with the graveyard, not the back row. But the idea is that you're basically going to be able to build up your ability to deal with back row in the form of Dragon, negate a monster on the board, so you're getting a 3 for 1, and also banishing free from the graveyard. Yes, of course, the same issue applies with Shidel Fusion as technically something like a Super Poly and, of course, a Graykeeper's Inscription. It's the fact that it is a normal spell card. It can also be stopped with Ash Blossom, and like Super Poly, it does take up space in the main deck, 2 more main deck slots and 1 extra deck slot. So it's something that you do need to consider and adapt to your deck specifically. However, a deck that is always fusion focused, stuff like Branded Fusion or a branded deck in general, Chimera deck as well, can utilize this combo and be very, very useful in order to deal with those graveyard cards of Promethean Princess and some of the Snake Eye cards as well. So that's pretty much it for all of those weird random tech cards that you might have been considering looking around. You can also consider something like Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, especially when we are going to be looking into most decks utilizing Link Summoning, which does allow you to fix your hand, set up a bit of targeted protection, and dig your deck for some side deck options. Nibiru is also another very cool option, especially if we move into a format where a lot of people do not worry about Nibiru and they're like, oh, I don't need to play around it, no one is playing it. If you are that 1 player out of 10 that is playing Nibiru, you will definitely catch your opponent off guard because they might get a little bit lapsical. Not to mention that there are a lot of rogue decks running around that I did mention that very rarely do play around Nibiru, and they kind of just go full steam ahead, and then when they get hit with a Nibiru, you might be like, ooh, I was not seeing that coming. So it's definitely something you can consider putting in the main deck. And what I do like to do sometimes is if I do main deck Nibiru, is sometimes you might want to side it out because your opponent will be more focused on playing around it where it's all possible. Now, if they're playing a deck that does not allow them to play through Nibiru, then of course you keep that in the main deck, especially a deck like Heroes, which is also being considered as an anti-meta option for the pure fact that being able to utilize a card like Darkworld will take away your opponent's graveyard, which is exactly what this format wants. So like I said at the start, you're either going to be playing with the graveyard or you can be taking the graveyard away, and that is going to give you the most chance of success as we move into the format until players start to adapt and start to learn of different ways to be able to protect the graveyard and being able to protect their ways of being able to utilize it for Promethean Princess, Fire Kings, and so on, alongside your Voiceless Voice cards as well, which may or may not be considered meta as we go forward. But you can kind of see that the different kind of separation with the upcoming meta is always going to be very, very important and interesting, especially with Labyrinth still running around, Kashtira's coming back into the fold, Thunderees also being considered as a nice budget option, not to mention new introductions for tower monsters in the form of Raid Raptors, Super Poly boards in the form of Yugioh, and then of course just the generic consistency cards and consistency decks of Fire Kings, Snake Eyes, and just basically the Fire format. So I hope this list has been very informative and a bit of a breakdown to give you a bit of an idea of what you may or may not want to be considering putting in your side deck. The best advice for all of this is to test out all of these different ones. You will know your local environment better than anyone. And when you're able to test these out, choose which ones you feel fit most and then utilize it with your deck to its max potential. You will learn more and more when the best time is to interact with your opponent, what decks these are best to be sided into, and everything else from that point on. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share. Till next time, as absolutely always, stay safe and of course, happy dueling.